Far too often, survivors of abuse by Catholic leaders are pressured to, quote unquote, forgive and forget after experiencing abuse. And in that way, they can be harmed yet again by leaders and community members who deny the abuse or who allow abusive leaders to maintain privileged positions in our communities. As we discussed at our last courageous conversation, this institutional betrayal causes more pain and more suffering. Restorative justice, which was originally developed within the criminal justice system, has been suggested as a potential path toward healing for survivors of abuse, as well as their communities and even the harm doers. Thus, the restorative justice model is often represented as a triad. There's the survivor, there's the perpetrator, and then there are their respective communities. The restorative justice process involves bringing those parties together and asking and working to answer three fundamental questions. One, who was harmed by what happened? Two, what do they need? Three, whose obligation is it to meet those needs? As we will discuss today, restorative justice can be a powerful tool, but the practice of it is a complex and delicate affair, requiring sincere and careful intention by all involved and all along the way. As we'll hear, our speakers sometimes refer to restorative justice as a kind of messy magic. So let me introduce them now. We're very honored to have with us two experts who use restorative justice practices to help Jewish organizations and groups in other faith traditions heal from the wounds of sexual harm. First, Dr. Alissa Ackerman is based in Fullerton, California. She holds a PhD in criminal justice from the City University of New York. She has served as a research assistant on the landmark 2011 John Jay Report, which was commissioned by the by the United States Council of Catholic Bishops to research the nature, scope, causes, and context of child sexual abuse within the Catholic Church. Alissa refers to herself as a pracademic, incorporating her academic training, practice, and personal experiences with sexual violence in her work. Alissa has written and spoken extensively on the topic of sexual violence and is the owner and co-founder of Ampersand's Restorative Justice, which offers restorative justice, quote, accessible to and inclusive of all the people and communities affected by sexual harm through capacity building and culture change, end quote. Dr. Guila Benchimol is joining us today from Toronto in Canada. She holds a PhD in sociological criminology from the University of Guelph and is also a trained restorative and transformative justice facilitator. In 2018, Guila helped launch the SRE, Safety, Respect, Equity Network, an organization that works to ensure safe, respectful, and equitable Jewish workplaces and communal spaces. She also served for several years on the board of the Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests, SNAP. Guila is Director of Faith-Based and Community Accountability for Ampersand's Restorative Justice, where she works with Alissa to bring restorative justice practices to people and communities affected by sexual harm. Members of the Awake community may remember that Guila joined us for a 2023 Courageous Conversation about how people from various faith traditions can learn from one another about addressing this issue. Near the end of our discussion, we'll be joined by Awake's Associate Director, Megan Feeblecorn, who will share about Awake's Bridge Dialogues program, which is inspired by these principles of restorative justice. So, enough from me. Let's begin our conversation. It will be moderated today by Catherine Hours, a member of Awake's staff and our Courageous Conversations team. So, Catherine, over to you.
Thanks, Christian. Thanks, Guila and Alissa, both to you for being here today. I'd love to begin by discussing your restorative justice work. Can you tell us about it? What kind of harms have you worked to address?
Sure. So I've been doing restorative justice work for about a decade. That work began with sexual harm cases, though as an undergrad, I had some experience working with juveniles who had committed all forms of low-level harms. But the work really began about a decade ago, when I had the opportunity to participate in what we call vicarious restorative justice. So I, as a survivor, sat with a group of men who had sexually harmed and did a restorative justice process. And from there, I put my academic hat back on and said, like, how can I bring this to more survivors? Because it was so life-changing. And so most of the cases that I work are sexual harm cases, although in the last couple of years, Guila and I have expanded out to other forms of harm, workplace abuse, gender-based harm that's not sexual violence related. But most of that work has been in sexual harm.
And I would credit the organizations that we have worked with for recognizing that when sexual harm occurs, it usually comes with other kinds of harms. And that is what led us to that expansion, is that they said to us, we know that most of the survivors that are going to participate in a process with you were harmed in sexual ways. However, we want to acknowledge that we have also caused harm in other ways, and we want to open up listening sessions for people who have been harmed in those ways. So to their credit, we were able to address other harms because restorative justice is not something that was created only to deal with sexual harm. And in fact, many people have argued that perhaps it is not the best way to address sexual harms, although Alissa and I would obviously, argue against that. But we have been able to address sexual harms as well as other kinds of harms, as Alissa mentioned.
Wonderful.
So it looks different when you're working with individuals than it does when you're working in institutions. So with individuals, we work directly with the person who was harmed and the person who caused the harm. But a lot of the cases that we work in faith communities, survivors are not interested in sitting with the person who harmed them directly. They really take issue with the way the institution betrayed them. And so while we are working on sexual harm, it is really the secondary betrayal, which is just as, if not more, harmful.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I wonder at this point, could you give us an example or two of a restorative justice opportunity that you've facilitated, perhaps one in a Jewish context, one in a Christian context, just to give us a little bit of a more concrete idea of what you're doing?
Sure. And I'm going to talk about the Jewish example, or one of the Jewish examples, because the way that it even started was that Alissa had been already doing this kind of work with individuals, and I was doing work around sexual harm in Jewish spaces. But I felt like I was sitting in the problem and we weren't getting to the solution. And I reached out to Alissa and I said, I think there is a gap here that restorative justice might be able to address, given your expertise. What do you think? And that gap was when the survivors want and expected more from their religious leaders, and therefore there is room to build some bridges. They are usually already in relationship with each other or had an existing relationship that they are often mourning. And so I said to Alissa, I think that this is an institutional gap that we can actually give something back to survivors who want it. And that is a key. It is when survivors are asking for those processes or are desiring some bridge building that we will engage. If survivors don't want it, we respect that. We understand it 100%. And so in this particular case that I'm thinking about, there was a 50-year retrospective investigation launched in a Jewish denomination, and that 50-year retrospective came out with a report. And one of the recommendations from that report that named the different harms that happened recommended a restorative justice approach. The movement was not really sure of what that even meant, and they reached out to us and said, can you teach us to lead a restorative justice process? And Alissa and I read the report ourselves, and we looked at each other and said, they are the harm doers. These religious leaders are the harm doers. How can they expect to lead a process? Why would the survivors trust them? But we wanted to test if we were right. And so we reached out to some of the advocates, and they told us exactly that. we're not going to sit with them and allow them to facilitate a process for us, but we are interested in somebody helping us create that bridge. And we actually called that project the Very Narrow Bridge Project, based off of a very famous Jewish quote, which is that we are all standing on a narrow bridge, and we shouldn't be afraid of walking forward if we can walk forward together. And so the Very Narrow Bridge Project was a project where we had 26 survivors in this particular denomination come together, and we did learning with the survivors. We did listening with the survivors. We wrote a big report about our findings, and then we also educated the religious leaders. Alissa, do you want to talk about the actual restorative justice activities that we did with them?
Sure. So we first started with survivor healing circles, and we led those for about 6 months. And then we held, as you can imagine, with 26 survivors, they have different needs and different wants and goals. And so for some of the survivors, we held one-on-one conversations between them and the head of the denomination or the general council of the denomination. We held a couple of those. And then we did, this was really interesting. So we always say that restorative justice is only as creative as you can be. And so no two processes look the same. So in this instance, what we did was sort of a fishbowl style restorative justice process. So in the first session, we had survivors in circle. We did this on Zoom. And we had the leaders of the denomination in the Zoom room watching this restorative justice circle about the ways that these survivors had been harmed. And we didn't have the leaders respond. But a week later, we came back and we had the leaders of the denomination in circle and the survivors all watching that conversation. And it was a really incredible, powerful experience for everybody involved. And then we did a restorative justice panel where several hundred people came to listen to leaders and survivors talk about what this project had meant to them.
Great, thank you. And so I'm seeing kind of highlighted in my head all the members of the restorative justice triad needing to be involved. Great, thank you. Do you feel like you have an example from a Christian context to share with us?
Sure. So we worked with a large multi-site church in California. And originally, in all of our projects, we first reach out to survivors and advocates. And in this project, they had a 30-year history of sexual abuse that had happened at the church. And no survivors came forward to participate. And so, we said to the pastor, we don't have a project here if there are no survivors. And he said, but we still need to be accountable. And so we built a year-long accountability curriculum, restorative curriculum, and we met with church leaders and staff across all of the sites from this church and trained them on what restorative accountability looks like. There was one survivor advocate who, reached out toward the end of the project and just sort of wanted to know, how it was going, how the training was going. And we told her, sort of what we had been doing, the activities we had been doing. And she wrote a letter to the leaders that we read to them. And they said it was the most powerful thing, that if what they were learning had changed only her life, it was worth it. But now they have the tools. If and when sexual harm happens again, they can respond in a restorative, accountable way that does not secondarily harm survivors.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think we're already kind of hinting at this in our conversation, but can we kind of pull out a little bit more some of the misunderstandings about and limitations of institutional restorative justice?
Sure. So some of the misunderstandings are around the goals, right? What is the purpose here? And oftentimes, right, we aren't always aware when we say, this is what I want. There may be some underlying desires there. And so Alissa and I have learned over time that it is important for us to interrogate that and to watch for when those desires change, which is really normal with survivors. As we continue to process the harms that happen to us, our needs might change. Our deeper understanding of what happened to us may require us to want different things. And so some of the misunderstandings are when institutional leaders say, we really want restoration, but what they're really looking is for forgiveness, or when they don't really believe the facts on the ground and they're like, we're going to take accountability, but behind the scenes, they're actually questioning whether what they're supposed to be taking accountability over happened. And Alissa, I'll let you talk about maybe some of the survivor misunderstandings.
Sure. So oftentimes we have survivors who come forward and say, what they want is accountability. What they want is, a conversation. They want answers. But actually, when we interrogate it, they want vengeance. And so you have these two sides, and we haven't even talked about the community yet, but you have these two sides where one is saying we want restoration, but really we want forgiveness. And the other is saying, we want accountability, but really we want vengeance. And when those two things happen, those misunderstandings make the goals of restorative justice very hard to fulfill. So we've gotten better at interrogating those things and explaining what the limitations of restorative practices are. And one of the things I always tell survivors is you cannot rely on the institution that harmed you to heal you. They can take accountability, they can do the hard work, but healing is still an internal job.
Great, thank you. Can we speak a bit more about the community and what their role in the triad and what they might be misunderstanding or not entirely clear about with institutional restorative justice processes?
Yeah, so when sexual harm happens, what we know and what the research bears out is that it impacts the communities to which all of the parties belong. So whether that is the survivor themselves, the person that caused the harm, or the institutional leaders that have allowed it to happen, or the faith movement group, site where it occurred, that harm ripples out to all of those community members. And so if a community is just standing back and watching, what they report is, this is between them, but for some reason, I also can't sleep, or I also don't know what to do, or my relationships have been fractured. And they're trying to figure out what their role is. And especially because we know how close-knit faith communities are, they have relationships with all these people and they don't know what to do and they don't know their role. Am I the judge and jury? Am I supposed to be investigating when somebody talks to me about something? What kind of questions am I supposed to ask? But the harm doer is my neighbor. And what do I do with that? Our kids play together. And so if we act like the community is uninvolved, that's a fallacy. They are involved. And we can use them to support the process. Number one, to support the process for survivors, to support the process for those who harmed to take accountability, but also to heal them as well, because they are caught up in the wave of those ripples.
And I would add that sometimes they are part of the harm. Right? When they see it and they look the other way, they don't want to get involved. So sometimes they are part of the harm and sometimes they are harmed. And so giving them an opportunity to both take accountability for the harm they may have caused and to have the opportunity to heal. And that's what the ampersand in ampersand's restorative justice actually means, that we can hold both of those things. You can be somebody who caused secondary harm and somebody who experienced it in the same instance. And we have to hold space for all of that. And restorative practices is about taking accountability from that, learning from your mistakes, and doing better the next time.
Sure, thank you. You've spoken about how when you think of these processes, you start with survivors, reaching out to them and hearing what they want. After doing that so many times with your practices, what do you think that survivors should know about engaging in restorative justice opportunities?
Yeah, so I think the first thing I already said, do not rely on the institution that harmed you to heal you. If you are coming into this process thinking that healing is going to be the outcome, you are going to be sorely disappointed because healing is an inside job, excuse me. Also, you should be aware that your goals might change, right? So as we learn with you about the impacts of trauma and trauma responses and secondary harm and institutional betrayal, you might find that what you wanted from the start is not actually what you want. And there's this beautiful term, kaleidoscopic justice. And it's this idea, like if you look in a kaleidoscope, the image changes as you turn that. as you turn the kaleidoscope. And it's the same thing here. As you're doing the work, your image of the harm and of its impacts shifts. So it's normal for your goals and your needs to change during the process. But one of the red flags we look for is that if they are continuing to change over and over and over, and every time we meet, the goalposts shift, then you're not really ready for a restorative process. And we have certainly seen that happen. We've seen it happen when we have signed accountability agreements or we're getting ready to sign them, and the survivor says, well, that's not actually what I wanted, even though we got to the place where we all agreed on the language of the agreement. And that was a mistake on our part as facilitators, as circle keepers, because we knew that the survivor wasn't ready for that phase of the project. And so, at the beginning, when we were introduced, we were called experts. And we're experts because we have PhDs. And in restorative practice, we are never experts because we learn from every single case and every process, and we do a postmortem on every single case. And so we're always learning, and we make mistakes too and have to be accountable for.
And I would add to that, Catherine. Sorry, there's a bit of a delay. I would add to that, that doesn't mean that restorative justice has not brought healing to survivors, and it can bring healing to survivors, but that inner healing from the original trauma is work that survivors need to ensure that they're doing with the appropriate professionals. A few other things I would just say that survivors should be aware of before entering a process. It's not going to work if you don't trust the facilitators, and that sometimes you need time to build that trust. And the second thing is that there may be times where you could feel bad because here I am coming again and asking the institution that harmed me to take accountability. And am I supposed to be believing them? And so you will be struck at times by, do I really want to be doing this? Why am I doing more work than they are? The third thing is that there are no guarantees, and that can feel really ungrounding for survivors who already have had their life upended by trauma, and that you're going to have to do a lot of work. It is a lot of work. You're going to have to learn. You're not always going to know the conversations between the facilitators and the institutions, not because anyone's hiding anything, but because they have to do their independent learning, just as you have to do your independent learning. And so you want to make sure that you are well resourced throughout the process, not just with facilitators, but that you have a good therapist and a good support system to guide you as you're going through it. Those are just some things. There are a lot more, but those are just some of the things to be aware of if you're going to consider a restorative justice process.
Thanks. So thinking of survivors who might be, considering engaging in opportunities that are available, can you think of what are some green flags for them to see and say, this could be something worth considering, this could be safe?
Yeah. So being very grounded and self-aware is an important green flag, and it's something that we work on with survivors and harm doers in this process. If you are coming into this process and you are easily triggered, that's a red flag. But if you are grounded in self and you are aware, that is certainly something that we are looking for. If you can articulate what you think your goals are, even if they're going to change, if you can articulate that and they are in line with restorative values, that's another green flag. If you come to this process and you say, I want to sue them for $1 million, we support you in doing that. That's not a restorative justice process or outcome. So having goals that are aligned with the process, and having realistic ideas about what a process like this can offer. Again, I want $1 million, not a realistic outcome. I want answers. I want changes within the institution. I want to hear the leader take accountability. I want an apology. Those are the kinds of outcomes that we see that are really realistic here. So that's another green flag. I think those are the three most important ones, like self-awareness, goals, and that they are in line with restorative processes and that they are realistic.
I want to add some green flags from the institution side because survivors are trusting an institution. And so some of those include the fact that the institution has created a budget for the process. And we do ask that that budget cover some of the survivor's therapy costs while in process. So that means that the institution understands those ripples of harm and how even later they may be reactivated. And so for a survivor to say, my facilitators are telling me that the institution is ready because they have assessed that through an actual assessment that we have. That is a green flag for a survivor. And the other one, and this was something we learned along the way, is that the institution is willing to include a survivor voice at their leadership table in the design of the process and in the oversight of how it's going. Because our client, and this is really important, I want to stress this, our client, the RJ client, is not the survivor and it is not the institution. Our client is the process. Our client is restoration, healing, justice, all of the values under restorative justice. And that can get really confusing for institutions and survivors saying, but aren't you supposed to be my advocate? Or we're paying you, aren't you supposed to be our advocate? We are everybody's advocate because we are advocating towards and for restoration.
And I would add one more thing, one more green flag on the institutional side is a willingness to make change. You can rearrange chairs in a circle and have a conversation, and that changes nothing, right? So there has to be a willingness to change the organization that allowed the harm to happen in the first place. And if you're not willing to do that, that's a big red flag. And we have stopped processes and canceled contracts because of that.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is that restorative justice takes time, takes logistical, financial investment, and is not a Saturday afternoon activity.
Yeah.
Okay. One question that I've been reflecting on, and I think we're starting to answer it already in this conversation, but wondering, have you found survivors to, I guess I had phrased it as experience healing, but we've already established that survivors shouldn't look for healing specifically through this. So maybe experience benefits in a restorative justice process when their specific harm doer hasn't participated. Like in our experience in the Catholic Church, unfortunately, abusers either refuse to participate or perhaps unable to because they were, had passed away or incapacitated by illness. So wondering, what have you seen in their kind of similar examples?
So we definitely have seen survivors in faith communities and specifically in the Jewish community feel a kind of healing or a kind of closure and many, many different kinds of benefits from participating in processes without the primary harm doer. And in fact, a key question in our listening sessions is, who do you hold responsible for the harm? And if you had the opportunity, who would you like to speak to? And in about 98% of our cases, it has not been the primary perpetrator. And so therefore, at the end, when it's a successful process, they have come back to us, sometimes right away and sometimes months later, and said, I didn't realize how badly I needed this, or I can finally go to a synagogue, maybe not the one that they used to go to, but to even be in a Jewish space. We had one case where the person couldn't even listen to Hebrew language anymore because of the sexual harm she had experienced by a rabbi. By the end of the process, she was considering engaging her children in Jewish life, something that she hadn't done for over 15 years. And so that was something she came to through the process and through the people she met and the work she did. Alissa, I know we have other examples.
Yeah, I would just add, as I hear you talking, Guila, we think of sexual harm as an individual problem. But if there's anything I learned, and especially working on the John Jay studies, this is not an individual problem. If it was an individual problem, we would not have over 3,000 priests accused of 10,000 instances of abuse. And that's just in the John Jay study, right? There's more than that. And we see this across faith communities. It's not just the Catholic Church. It's every Jewish denomination. It's every Christian denomination. It's everywhere. And if we treat it like an individual problem, we're never actually going to get to the root cause. And I think that's why survivors want the conversation with the institution where the harm occurred, because there is something about the makeup of the institution, the layout of the institution, institutional policy that allows these kinds of harms to continue. And so if we only address it as a, individual bad apple problem, we're not going to fix it.
And Catherine, that goes back to the communal role, right? So many of us are here today as concerned members of our communities or our faith communities. And so what is my role? It's to understand that sexual harm is not something that they did over there, but that we are all a part of. And so we have opportunities to create change. We have opportunities to promote restoration and to promote policy changes, et cetera, which I hope we'll get to later. But it is a communal issue. And it is not the survivor's job to create that change. And unfortunately, in faith communities, time and time again, they have been responsibilized to do that. And it's not fair.
Yeah, thanks for saying that. As we reflect more on harm doers in this restorative justice process, Alissa, we know that working with offenders has been a large part of your career. Can you share with us how you were drawn to this way of addressing the problem?
Yeah, so I was actually in a class in my master's program. And the person who taught that class was Dr. Karen Terry, who was the principal investigator of the John Jay studies on the Catholic Church. And I remember sitting in that class thinking, why am I here? As a survivor, right? I was not open as a survivor, but as a survivor, why am I taking a class that can be so triggering? I always thought that I would be working with survivors in the long term, like that's how I was going to end sexual violence. I didn't want anybody else to experience the impacts like I had experienced. And in that class, very quickly that I learned that if you want to end the problem, you actually have to go upstream and work with the people causing the problem, right? You don't end the problem by working with those who have been impacted. That's really important work. And some of the most important honorable work I've done in my life has been with survivors. But that doesn't stop the problem. And so I learned that I had to go upstream. And so early in my master's program, began doing that work, working in prisons and civil commitment centers, working on the John Jay studies, working with priests, and helping them to come to accountability. And I think that's how we end this. And one of the beautiful things about working with Guila, right? We come from different parts of the Jewish faith community. We come from different places on solving this problem. Guila has primarily worked with survivors. I have primarily worked with harm doers, and you need both. There's that ampersand again. Right? So I'd say I learned very early on that I had to go upstream.
Thank you. And Guila, I know that when we met to prepare for this conversation, you mentioned a little bit about an initial hesitancy in working with Alissa and then finding common ground. Can you reflect on that again, please?
Sure. So it wasn't hesitancy in working with Alissa, it was with the approach or some of the approaches. So when we started working together, we met because Alissa participated in my doctoral study on how survivors themselves become advocates in their own right. And I learned about her restorative justice work in that call. And it is not common, I would say, for academics to stay in touch with participants of their studies. And it is not common for academics to make public who is in their study, but I got special dispensation for that because the survivors in my study said, naming myself as somebody who was a survivor who became an advocate is part of my advocacy. And I had to actually do a whole new kind of presentation to the research ethics board. And so Alissa was in my study and we stayed in touch after that. And she was calling me about her work and I was calling her about my work. And then I said, I think there's a gap here that we can work together on, especially given your expertise. And so I would say to her, like, why is the institution acting like this? And she would say, well, because they are harm doers and this is how they show up. And she would say, why are survivors showing up this way? And I would say, well, because their trauma is activated. And so they are acting like a survivor. So that was helpful. But the moment that gave me pause was when we were about to have a meeting with a survivor, and she said, they have to understand the humanity of the harm doers or the institution that harmed them. And I said, wait, I cannot go into the meeting like with those words. And so let's talk through what does it mean for a survivor to witness the humanity of the people who harm them. And here I'm talking more institutionally, although it applies even to the harm doer. How do we say that? How do we hold that? And how do we make space for the anger that is likely to arise? And who are we to be asking a survivor to take a moment to see the humanity? And so that was really the moment that showed us the importance of slowing down and having those tough conversations with each other. A few months ago, we were in San Francisco, where were we?
San Francisco.
San Francisco, yeah. And in the middle of a presentation, Alissa said something, and I stopped, and in my head, I said, I have to talk to her about this later. And an audience member rose her hand and she was like, how can you tell a survivor that? And I said, thank you for saying that. That's on the agenda for our next meeting. But it was, what are we asking survivors to hold that is going to be hard for them to hold, but that is necessary for restorative justice to take place?
And you see me smiling as Guila is talking about this. And I want to add, and I will say this to survivors, if you want somebody, whether it's an institutional leader or a direct harm doer, to be able to take full responsibility and accountability, you have to honor their humanity. I have to. That's my job, right? As somebody who works with harm doers. It's not the job of the survivor. And survivors often have a hard, or would have a hard time if they saw the relationship that I have to build with harm doers, right? I have made that my life's work. So if you want somebody to really get it, and I can give you a great example. I worked with a Mennonite pastor who had engaged in like online conversations with a 21-year-old woman, and it was a very sexualized conversation, and he didn't see what was wrong with it. He was reprimanded by the church, but still didn't really get it. And he came kicking and screaming to this process. And in order to get him to a place where I could walk through, I had the transcripts of the conversation and walk through it and show him, I had to build trust with him. And so it's like gently helping people move toward accountability, and that requires relationship building. And if they think that I am judging them, if they think that I am going to shame them, then we can never do the work. And that's what I mean by honoring the humanity of the people who have caused harm. It's because I want to end the problem. And I have been called all sorts of names while doing this work. And if you actually knew me and knew my story, which I share a little bit here, you know that it is not because I am a rape apologist. It is because I wholeheartedly believe, and I have seen it work with hundreds and hundreds of mostly men who have caused harm, that connecting on that human level is what helps move them toward a place where they stop causing this kind of harm.
Thank you. And this strikes me as another part of where we need to keep in mind the triangle and the role of the community in responding to the harm doers, right?
Absolutely.
And Catherine, you said before about restorative justice bringing healing. What we have found is when a process has ended in the harm doer or institutional leader who's the harm doer taking accountability and committing to change, that is when the survivor says, okay, it's not my job now to keep that going. I'm going to trust in what they are telling me in our agreement, that they're going to change policy, they're going to change process, and that they are not going to do this again. And they have an understanding, this is an important time to talk about power and shame, right? The survivor might feel so powerless in a process, and they are ashamed of what happened to them, what they were made to endure, that is not their shame to carry. But what they don't see is that the institution thinks, oh my gosh, we have to do everything that the survivor says, or they're going to cancel us or post about us or sue us or whatever it might be. And they feel powerless, even though institutions we know have a lot of power, have a lot of money. And they are ashamed. They are ashamed that they didn't live up to the values, but they don't always have the humility to show up and name that. And so our process is to help people name the shame, carry the shame, and redirect it in a healthy way towards change.
Okay, thanks. I want to keep thinking about this. I feel like there's so much to dive into here. And I'm sure that everyone listening is having lots of different thoughts. So I'm just going to pause and make a plug for those who are available to join us next week for part 2 and small group discussion. I'm really interested to hear what everyone is thinking, both live and those who are going to be watching the recording. Really interested to hear your reactions on all of this. I think maybe moving to our next question, thinking about those here who are in positions of authority in the church. We have some victim assistance coordinators, safe environment coordinators in the Catholic world who might be interested, in kind of learning more. What would you say to them? What should they know about offering restorative justice opportunities?
I would say that the first thing that they should know is that these processes have to be survivor-centered and survivor-driven. That doesn't mean that survivors get everything they want in a process. But processes cannot be driven by the institution. Now, most of the cases that we take start with an institution reaching out. But unless, survivors are interested in the process, like I said, with the multi-site church, we did an accountability training in a restorative way. That was not a restorative justice process because it wasn't driven by survivors. So I think that's the most important thing. This has to be survivor-centered and survivor-driven. And if the changes that you are making or trying to make are not based on what their needs are, then you're doing it wrong. If all you're going to do is listen, and we have seen this happen in projects that we did not take, where the institution says, well, we're going to listen to survivors, and then they're going to stop there, that's not enough. That's not restorative justice. Restorative justice really is about the changes that you are willing to make and sustain over time. So if you're not willing to do that, there's no point in even engaging because you will cause more harm. You cannot just give empty words.
Yeah, and I think what Alissa is getting at is that restorative justice is a real thing, right? There are words that have become buzzwords, and I think restorative justice has become a buzzword, but there is a theory behind it, there's a foundation behind it, and there's a practice. And so it is wonderful if any of these coordinators or professionals in different sites want to engage. They can turn to trusted experts. There are people like us out there. We are out there. We have an entire curriculum that we designed for churches, and others have as well. And so get the guidance that you need, understand why you are doing what you are doing, and sit and go through the assessment of whether you're ready. And understand that just because you want to do it, it doesn't mean that survivors have to or will want to. How are you going to do it in a way that does not cause further harm is really, really key before you engage. You can't start it and then say, now we're not going to cause harm. You've already caused harm. So you have to start with, how are we not going to cause further harm?
And you can do the work, and survivors may still never forgive you, never want to be in a relationship with you. You do it because it's the right thing to do.
Okay. Thanks. Wow. So much to think about here. I want to take this time now and talk about a program that Awake offers, which is our Bridge Dialogues program, based on restorative justice theory and practices. And in this program, we bring together 3 Catholic priests and 3 abuse survivors in a confidential setting for facilitated conversation. And I'd like to invite our Associate Director, Megan Feeblecorn, on screen now to share a little bit about this program.
Yeah.
Hi, Megan.
Hey, Catherine. Thank you so much for having me here and allowing me to just speak briefly about Awake's Bridge Dialogues. So as you said, our Bridge Dialogues bring together three priests and 3 abuse survivors in a safe, confidential, neutral setting. And it really this initiative was born out of the desire of survivors through feedback that we had received that there was a desire for survivors to be able to share their stories, share their experiences, share the harm that was done in a neutral setting through a facilitated conversation. And so we had a pilot year about 3 years ago in 2023, where we invited those people who were already connected with Awake to be a part of these conversations. And so we were able to sort of refine the process. And then we launched these dialogues publicly in the fall of 2024. And so we host them monthly or almost monthly. And we have people everyone who participates is connected to Awake and has gone through at least a welcome call is what we call it. So a one-on-one conversation with a member of Awake staff. As Guila and Alissa were talking about, ensuring that people are ready to participate in something like this. We take that very seriously, and sort of a vetting process, if you will, for the priests who participate, as well as ensuring that the survivors who have expressed a desire to participate are ready as well. And so it's based on the principles of restorative justice. There are some differences. This is a one-time conversation, usually with people who have not met each other. And there's not an ongoing conversation, so it's not an ongoing lengthy process. It is a single conversation that's facilitated by trained volunteers and by members of Awake staff. But it's really a time for honest sharing between the survivors and the priests who come as representatives of the institutional church to listen, to learn, to receive these stories, to apologize, and to be able to also share some of their own experiences from within the church as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. Can you tell us a little bit, like what are themes that come up in the responses you get from survivors and priests after their participation?
Sure. Yeah. So each dialogue, we follow each dialogue with an immediate debrief session where we separate the priests and survivors into separate groups to debrief with a member of the facilitation team. And so we get that immediate feedback, and then we follow up to allowing, when there's been a little bit more time to process, we solicit feedback from survivors and priests who have participated. And a continuing theme that comes up from the survivors is definitely that it is, emotionally difficult, but that it is very important and impactful to feel heard, to be believed. For many people showing up to these conversations, the reporting process, if they have chosen to report, or even just sharing with other members of the wider Catholic community has been met, has caused more harm if it's been met with disbelief or with blame. And so having an opportunity to share and be heard and believed is very important. And also for survivors, during the dialogue, we give an opportunity for the survivors to speak into the problem themselves. So really an opportunity to also offer, if they desire, some of that sort of hard-won wisdom of what they have experienced, and allow them to speak directly to priests who have an ability to be in those spaces to, potentially affect change. So that's something that, comes up, but really that feeling of being heard, believed, is just really important for the priests. We've had priests share how this has helped to inform their ministry, how it humanizes the issue. Now, the priests who participate, similarly to survivors, everybody is coming from, we've got a diverse backgrounds, wide variety of people. We've had priests come from different dioceses, from different religious orders, older, younger, ordained for many, many years, and maybe only ordained for a few years. But the priests have talked about how it informs their ministry. We've had some share that they will have preached about it. Of course, keeping confidentiality, but sharing some of the themes and what they've learned, how it humanizes the issue. In the church, we talk a lot, or it's been over 20 years that at the forefront, within Catholic circles, speaking about the abuse crisis or the issue of abuse in the church, but it really humanizes the issue to hear these deeply personal accounts and experiences from people. So to hear those firsthand accounts and see things maybe through a lens that they hadn't before.
Thanks. Yeah. And what have you learned in your experience from this as a facilitator?
I think, well, first of all, the absolute sacred nature of the conversation. The what a privilege it is to be able to be in the space with people sharing such deeply personal experiences. So, I've learned just by listening and hearing the stories of the survivors as they've shared, it's difficult, but it's also such an honor to be able to even be present and to witness the back and forth dialogue that takes place. And I see how fruitful it is too. This is a very heavily facilitated conversation. So everything is, where transparency is really important. So we send out information ahead of time so everyone knows who is participating, exactly what questions will be asked, this sense of safety from that, just complete transparency so everyone knows what to expect, which initially to me as I was training to become a facilitator, I didn't have a lot of experience with this type of facilitated conversation, but I've come to see how fruitful it is for people to be able to share freely within those parameters, and the way that it can ease tension, kind of like the defenses, when everyone knows what to expect, and that we have cultivated this very intentional space of safety for the participants.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing a bit about this. It's one of those programs that I know a lot of people in our community have heard about, but fewer of them have participated. So I'm glad we have the chance to reflect on it for a broader audience. Guila and Alissa, I would love to invite you at this point. How is Bridge Dialogues kind of similar and different from some of the restorative justice practices that you use? I'm already kind of noticing in some ways we do have the triad represented. In other ways, we're somewhat missing that community bar, but present in other ways, perhaps through the idea of the awake community. I don't want to put words in your mouth.
So before we get to the similarities, I just want to pause for a minute, and nobody asked me to say this, but I'm marveling sitting here. Just, I met Sarah Larson years ago, and I was invited to a Courageous Conversation years ago, and I have watched Awake grow and shift, and I have watched how you've included survivor voices, and I get your emails, and I read the stories, and I'm listening to Megan now, and I'm just so moved by what you have done for survivors and for your community. And I'm so grateful as a Jewish person to be able, and as a survivor, to be able to learn from what you are doing. And I literally said to Alissa, Megan, listening to you, like, what if we could do this with rabbis and Jewish leaders and survivors? It would be so powerful. So if that happens, it will be thanks to you all. And I just want to take a moment to give you all recognition for what you've done and how far you've come and how you've integrated survivor wisdom and voice and expertise to your process without fear. It takes courage. I know these are courageous conversations. They really are courageous. I just wanted to take a moment to say that. And nobody asked me to say that, and it wasn't planned. I'm just feeling it very strongly right now.
That's really kind. Thank you.
And I second everything that Guila shared. I want to speak to some of the similarities that I heard. So Megan, you talked about the sacred nature of these conversations. And that is a word that Guila and I use in every process. Like we'll get off a call and we'll be like, this is sacred, holy work that we are doing. And so that is very much a similarity. The heavily facilitated nature of the conversation is also very similar. So, we co-create the conversations that we're going to have, and there are no surprises for anybody. Everybody knows ahead of time what questions we're going to be asking, what order we're going to be asking them in, who's speaking first, who's speaking last, who's in the room. So that's very much a similarity. And the transparency that you talked about is also very, very key. Guila, do you want to talk about some of the differences, or do you want me to continue?
Sure. I mean, some of the differences are the kinds of education. So we have an entire tailor-made curriculum for each process that we run that is about the specific harm that happened between the survivor or survivors and the institutional leaders they will be meeting with. And so that is a key component where it is specific to what happened. And so therefore, coming in, people are not just well-resourced, but they have been educated. And so the survivor is going to talk about what happened to them, and the institutional institutional leaders are expected to respond drawing from the education that they learned with us, and that can take a few months to a year and a half. I think the longest process we did was 2 years. So that is one of the differences. The other difference are the people that are in the room. So we will bring in community members that are tied to the institution and tied to the survivor. And sometimes people that are tied to both of them, which is really amazing because they could model that dual support role. And so we might bring in members of the board of the institution that will then have to make some decisions after. And I'll end with that big difference, which is there are agreements that are made at a process. And those are expectations from the institution to the survivor that are signed and that we follow up with them on. But Megan, what you're doing is unbelievable.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for sharing that, and thank you both for the work that you're doing with restorative justice. Yeah.
Wonderful. All right, I think that this is a great time to move to audience questions. We had several come in advance, and I know several that are coming in behind the scenes. And I want to make sure we get to as many as possible. So I think Gil and Alissa, I think we would love to hear more about restorative justice practices that are maybe available outside the traditional model. Ideas maybe that individuals could kind of take into our interactions. I think you mentioned earlier that you're doing some restorative justice coaching. Yeah, what can you tell us about that?
So I would start by saying that restorative justice is not one thing, right? We talked about a very specific kind of restorative practice that we engage with faith institutions. But for us, we believe that restorative justice is a way of being. So we don't just put on the facilitator hat and engage restorative justice. It's how we seek to live our lives. And it is very much for us aligned with our faith values. So you can do restorative justice without having to be a facilitator and without having to engage a big process the way that we do. It's how you interact with everyday people. It's the way you honor somebody's humanity. It's the way you stand up for those who are oppressed. It is, speaking truth to power when you see horrible things happen. That's all part of restorative justice. And it also means standing up and being accountable for your own mistakes. Like I have seen people in my, professional world who cannot acknowledge that they broke the stapler or the copy machine. And if you can just say, yep, I did that. I made that mistake. That's living into restorative values. And so that's, if people are trying to figure out ways that they can do this, it starts there. It just starts with how you are, not what hat you wear.
And in terms of the actual activities, so I want to talk about two of them. One is for survivors and one is for institutional leaders. So for survivors, what we have done was lead community circles. And so that's just a different kind of circle where survivors might find restoration and healing among other survivors. In this particular case, we had survivors that were all harmed in the same denomination, but in different sites of that denomination and by different people. And so we did community building circles with survivors for 6 months where we came together to meet with them. It was facilitated conversation where they could just share. It had nothing to do with the institution. The leaders weren't there. They were never going to hear about this. And at the end, some of the survivors said, I didn't know how badly I needed to be among this group. And we also continued it once we saw that the institution wasn't taking their needs seriously. And so this was something to give just for survivors. In terms of the coaching, as we said before, restorative justice takes a long time. And so what do you do when people are already in relationship with each other and they're kept apart until they can be safely brought together by a process? Are there ways to expedite that in safe manners? And so for leaders that really want to get it right, and they know what they want to do, and they understand the survivor dynamics, oftentimes they don't need this 18-month process. We could just meet with them and listen to where they want to go, listen to what their policies lay out, and help move them to a place where they can safely address the survivor needs on their own. And so that's what we've been doing with restorative coaching. And it's actually been quite successful because we're empowering the leaders who already want to do right.
Sure, thank you. We have another question from an audience member asking, how do you respond? How do you respond to the survivor, or what should a survivor do if they're ready for a restorative justice conversation and the harm doer is not?
I mean, that's a very real concern. So in our practice outside of institutional work, we can offer vicarious processes, right? And so you sort of talked about this before with, harm doers who are incapable, harm doers are deceased or who are incapacitated in some way. It's still very powerful to hear somebody take accountability. And so we do a lot of that work at Ampersands, doing vicarious processes for survivors. And the truth of the matter is, it goes back to this idea that you cannot rely on the person who harmed you to heal you. They may never be ready to take accountability. How do you still navigate the world when that person will never take accountability? And we see that a lot. And so it's the internal work, it's the community building work, it's the communal support that we bring together, which can be incredibly, incredibly powerful. And so there are ways to bolster support around a survivor that don't include the harm doer. And we also say that restorative justice never gives up. But it is important to acknowledge that some harm doers will never be capable and will never be ready to engage.
Yeah, that's tough to hear. And I'm finding comfort in your honesty. Yeah.
And to be honest with survivors about that matters, right? As Brene Brown says, clarity is kindness. And so it's very important. Sometimes the healing will come in conversation with us where we will help listen. We can hold what they're saying and we can make it really clear about why. But we have also referred people to other religious leaders that they could speak to. And that sometimes heals some of the pieces of the wound that they were hoping to heal in an RJ process.
Yeah, thank you. One question we had was kind of about language, and in what ways are the names we use for the roles in the restorative justice system helpful or limiting? We at Awake, we've spent a lot of time discussing language, the difference between victim, survivor, acknowledging that some people prefer the terms like coper or thriver. So wondering, do you find success in the restorative justice process, kind of correlated to the use or not use of specific terms?
So the language is something we also talk about a lot, and it was actually a key question in my doctoral study around when I asked survivors, what is the term that you like to refer to yourself as? And, I had people say victim specifically because I didn't survive. I'm a whole different person. I had people say survivor. Victim means up until the time I was harmed, and survivor is after. And then I had people say thriver. And then some said none of these terms capture where I am now in my journey. Some said a person who has metabolized the harm. Others said someone on a journey of forgiveness. That was her own, desire of what she was doing. So there are particular terms we use, and this is something I know Alissa ingrained in me also early on around harm doer versus offender and perpetrator, person who was harmed versus victim or survivor. And we find the language a little clunky sometimes. We had an institutional leader who said we implanted the word harm in his institution where harm clearly happened. He was completely averse to the idea that harm happened because of how it implicated him. And so how do you get around that when clear harm happened? So we are having big conversations about language, and language matters a lot. Alissa, what would you add to that?
So I would add that whatever language a survivor, victim, thriver uses to describe themselves, we will honor.
Yes.
And person first language is really important. We are not the worst thing that ever happened to us, and we are not the worst thing we've ever done. And so when we use language like offender, we are saying that the person is only that thing. And that makes it hard for them to change. And so and in our field, even, right? My professional organization used to be the Association for the Treatment of Sexual Abusers. We changed our name to the Association for the Treatment and Prevention of Sexual Abuse.
Mm.
So person first language is really important. And when it comes to the person who caused harm, we use language like person who caused harm or harm doer instead of perpetrator or offender. And when it comes to the person who experienced harm, we honor the language that they use. And sometimes that language changes.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I'm again interested to hear what our audience members are thinking and eager for thoughts on that in part 2 and small group discussions. Let's see, another question here. Can you give us ideas about specific reparative actions that have emerged from the restorative justice dialogues that you facilitated? Or are there others that you haven't seen from yours, but heard of working well in other groups?
I mean, go ahead. No,
Okay.
you start.
So in individual cases, typically the reparative actions that survivors are asking for and that we see are for their therapy to be paid for the harm doer to tell the truth about what happened to their family and their friends, to make donations to survivor-centered organizations, to live in sobriety. So those are, and to answer questions, those are basically the things that we see. In institutional cases, we still see I need you to pay for therapy. I need you to tell the truth. But I need you to make systematic changes within this organization. So sometimes that's renaming a fellowship that was named in honor of the person who caused harm. Sometimes that's changing HR policy. Sometimes that is removing people from positions of power that they hold. Mm-hmm. But it really comes down to the changes that you are going to make within the institution to ensure that behavior like this doesn't happen again. So in some ways it's quite different, right? They're not asking for institutional leaders to live in sobriety. They are asking individual harm doers to do.
And I'll just add to that, the public apologies have really, really made a difference to survivors. And that's like one big theme that we hear is that, this harm affected me so badly, and oftentimes it has made the news. And so therefore your apology has to be public as well. I want people to know that you took this public accountability. And another one that we have seen is complicating the true nature of the actual person who caused harm. So an institution, like when Alissa said about changing the name of a fellowship, but even writing the history of, let's say, a rabbi, not denying the good that they did, but adding to it some of the harm that they did. And when survivors say that, we know that they are living in the ampersands too, because they're not saying delete them. They are saying, yes, I understand that they did all this other leadership, but they also did this to me and to others. And so I want them to complicate that history. That's not always easy for institutions to wrap their heads around. And that's where we come in.
They have done it.
Yes, they have done it.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Do you have suggestions for resources, trainings? What would be helpful for people who are who might be interested in facilitating restorative justice? Where would you direct them? Is that something you all offer yourselves?
It's a great question. Yes, it is something that we offer. We do train future facilitators. And the truth of the matter is there really aren't a lot of places that do train facilitators for this specific kind of harm. And I think that's really important. There are wonderful, wonderful facilitators out there in the world. But if you do not understand the dynamics of sexual harm and of institutional betrayal, you will cause more harm. So we offer trainings. The University of San Diego offers trainings, not for faith leaders, but I actually lead a class there for Title IX officers for college campuses on restorative practices. That's a year-long course through the University of San Diego, but Ampersands does offer training as well.
And I do think it's important if you are working in a faith community or you are working with people who were harmed in a faith movement, whether or not they are still believers of that faith or members of that faith group. Restorative justice training with a faith lens makes a big difference. And those have been the most moving sessions that we have had when we focus on faith. And I would say there's not like one or two sessions that are just about faith. It is interwoven in everything because that's what drives those of us who live in that world, right? It's those values. They are a way of living, just like restorative justice is a way of living. And so it's really important to make sure you're hitting all the marks that you want to hit when you're going to do the restorative justice work.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. This might be our last question. We might sneak one more in, depending on how long you take to answer. But wondering, so you mentioned earlier working with a large group of survivors. And so this is a great question. Wondering, how do you work with survivors when they are, divided in their goals and the way they want to engage with an institution? Do you engage with those survivors individually? Do you try to work with them as a group? In your experience, what brings the best restorative outcomes?
The answer is yes, right?
Yes,
Like,
and.
yes, and.
Yeah.
So in this large denominational project that we talked about at the beginning, we worked with survivors as a group, and then we also worked with survivors as individuals. Not everybody wanted a conversation with the head of the denomination, but some people did. And so we worked with them individually to prepare them for those conversations. Some people wanted other things from the institution, and we worked with the institution to try to meet those needs. And one of the things we have to be honest with survivors about is that their needs sometimes will clash. We just finished a project with a church where some of the survivors wanted the church to disband, and other survivors didn't want that. And as a restorative justice value, we could not recommend that the church disband. And so some of the survivor advocates didn't trust us. And we ended up not continuing to work with the organization. It was passed off for an investigation to happen. But the learning that we had done with church leaders led to one of the most beautiful public apologies we've ever seen. And so, sometimes we're not the right cup of tea for certain survivors, and that's okay too. Knowing what our limits are is important.
Yeah, thank you so much. Really, I think getting to the idea of this being messy and a process.
That's why we call it the messy magic.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much. I am so appreciative of what you shared and the generosity and your wisdom. And I won't say expertise if you would prefer not to be called experts. I think at this point, I'm going to turn things over to Erin O'Donnell, who has a few closing announcements, but she will be back to ask you for suggestion action steps for members of our audience. What should we be, kind of thinking about and taking away as we're moving on from this conversation?
Excellent. Thank you so much. And sincere thanks to you both, Alissa and Guila, for sharing your expertise and giving us so much good stuff to mull today. My name is Erin O'Donnell, and I'm a volunteer member of Awake's leadership team and part of the Courageous Conversations planning team. One intention of the Courageous Conversations series is to inspire personal action. So I'm going to invite our panelists back on screen in just a moment to share some closing thoughts about actions we might each consider taking. But first, I have a few quick announcements. We will be gathering again on Zoom, as Catherine mentioned, next week for a small group discussion of this rich topic, and I really encourage you to join us. This is a great opportunity to share what resonated with you and what you're still pondering, and to hear from others who might have similar or totally different ideas from you about what we heard today. So please watch your email for more details on registering for this small group discussion. You'll be receiving an email either later today or tomorrow. And that's happening next week on Thursday, May 21st at 7 p.m. Central Time. So next Thursday will be our last Courageous Conversations event for the season. Keep an eye on the Awake newsletter this summer for information about our topics, speakers, and dates for this fall. We'll be working hard to prepare the next season. So the Awake community will gather for a prayer service called Seeking Hope, a summertime prayer service on Zoom on Tuesday, June 16th at 7 p.m. Central Time. We'll include a link to sign up to attend live or receive the recording in our follow-up email. So let's return to our panelists to hear from them one more time. Guila, I'd like to start with you. What action step would you recommend to our audience members who want to engage in or promote restorative justice in their corner of the church or in their community?
So I've been thinking about this question, given the cautions that we have given around who should be leading and what you need to know. So if you are a survivor and you believe that the institution that harmed you or some of the leadership may be open to a restorative justice process with you, I would suggest making sure that you are taking care of yourself, getting the resources that you need for your own healing that is outside of the RJ process before engaging. And, asking people to help you find the right people. You don't have to make this your life job, and it's probably not healthy if you make this your life job, but to make sure that you are taking care of yourself and that you're really, really clear on the difference between your wants and your needs. Wants are probably not all going to be met in a restorative justice process, but your needs, your safety needs and healing needs are things that will be considered. If you're a community member, I heard something brilliant yesterday by a colleague named Dr. Shira Berkowitz, which she just said, we talk a lot about mandated reporting. And she said yesterday, what if we talked about mandated supporting? And so what if we all became mandated supporters of survivors? What if we became mandated supporters of accountability for harm doers, right? If I'm in community with somebody who caused harm, how can I help them as their friend or as their pastor or as their whatever? Get to the place where they are more likely to do the right thing. And so that's just a question I'll leave the audience with. What does it mean to be a mandated supporter? Again, not for survivors in the room. You don't have to support anyone but yourself, but for the others in the room, what does it mean to be a mandated supporter? Alissa, I'll leave to you some other ideas.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Guila.
I love that mandated supporter.
Please go ahead, Alissa. What action step would you recommend to our audience? Anyone who wants to engage in these practices.
I echo everything that Guila has shared. I think even if you are not a survivor, but you want to engage this work, you need to be grounded and supported. You cannot take care of others if you are not taking care of yourself. And if you do not have good boundaries while you're doing the work, sometimes, especially empaths, will take on the feelings of others. And I know Guila and I have both had to learn how to separate what's theirs and what's ours and leaving it at the door. So being grounded and self-aware and having good boundaries and having support to engage this work with survivors and those who have caused harm is really, really key.
Terrific. Thank you, both of you, for your thoughtfulness and your insights. This has been really a gift today. We're truly grateful. And so we've reached the point in our conversation where we say that the leadership of Awake is motivated by our faith to do this work. And when we gather, we pray together. So we will end today with a short prayer, and we invite anyone who wishes to stay to join us in our prayer. We know that there are very good reasons that some may not choose to stay. If you'd like to sign off now, please know that we wish you peace and goodness, and that we hope to see you again soon. And so now, as we begin our closing prayer, let us remind ourselves that, as always, we're in the presence of God who is love. And feeling that presence now, we collect ourselves, knowing that listening is an act of love. Thank you, loving God, for bringing us together and giving us the sacred gifts of community and the wisdom we have heard today. May we hold each other in our hearts, each doing our part to cultivate love, hope, and healing that leaves no one out and no one behind as we continue to build this beloved community. Amen. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Take care.